Hi, this is Dr. Jose Saldivar with another episode of the We to College podcast. One of the cool things about the podcast is it's allowed me to connect with folks who, otherwise I might never connect with. But the network that I've been able to utilize has allowed me to expand my own network and meet people doing amazing things, doing really cool things. And today's guest is one of those individuals. And so I'm gonna turn it over to him and let him introduce himself to the audience. So Luis, would you mind introducing yourself?
Sure, of course, not at all. So my name is Luis-Genaro Garcia. I'm a professor of art education at Sacramento State, and I'm going into my fourth year at Sacramento. Prior to that, I was a teacher. I was an art teacher at my former high school, and I spent my first 14 years as an educator, focusing on improving the experiences for marginalized students through art education. A lot of the things that I did is I brought in critical perspectives and critical theories into my art education classroom, and eventually I started making connections of what I was teaching in the classroom to engaging students outside of the classroom by drawing from not only their home knowledges, but also the learning that they were developing.
Oh man, that's cool. I'm eager to get into your story because I think you touched on a couple of words that I guess ahorita in education, right, are buzzwords, right? Right, like critical. The word critical. Anytime we say the word critical, right? People, depending on who you are, right, your ears perk up, and what do they mean by that, right? And we can get into that. But Luis, thank you for joining me. And Luis, I always ask my guests this first question is if you had to go back and identify a moment in time when you could say my educational journey started at that point, what would that point be for you?
Man, so many crossroads and experiences that happened for me was in 1992. Um, I was 14 and my parents had just separated. So I wasn't even giving any time to process the possibility of my parents separating. It was just my parents kept it from me and my siblings, and from one day to the next, my mom said, "Hey, put your put all your stuff in a bag. We're leaving." And I'll leave it there, right? Because it was just something that I was kind of forced to do without being prepared for it. But that same year, the 1992 riots happened, and you know, again, I was 14, right? Not still processing this separation, right, from my parents, being transitioning into being the eldest in a single parent household, and now this disorder, right, a social disorder that was happening in our communities. And I kept up with the news, but as a 14-year-old, right, I was more interested in hanging out with my friends, but I processed all of everything that was going on, from the media to what actually happened in the streets to the aftermath, right? And even now, it's become a big part of my artwork and the way that I teach. But that moment in 92, and the particular moment, to answer your question, was when I looked over the roof of my building
Mhm.
and I saw, I couldn't even, I lost count because I couldn't count with my fingers of how many puffs of black smoke I saw throughout the city. Like, just overlooking the area where I lived, there were more than 10 fires happening at the same time. Um, and my particular moment of realization of where I was living and what my social circumstances were was when I saw a man pushing a grocery cart full of just all kinds of food, right? Or groceries, but he was pushing the grocery cart running down the street. And right across the street from where I lived, the sidewalk was uneven.
Mhm.
Right? And he was running so hard with the cart that when he hit the little uneven part of the sidewalk, like a bunch of food spilled, right? He kept the cart, you know, from falling, but like he kind of kept going. He kind of like stalled and looked back and thought, oh, should I go pick this up? But right behind him were people just picking up whatever he dropped. And you know, it was at that moment that I realized this is where I'm coming out of, right? And these are the circumstances of my community, and it is what it is, right? At that point, I didn't have the mind that I have now, right?
Mhm.
But that was just, to me, was foundational in the way that I think in terms of my philosophy of teaching, and my philosophy of criticizing, right, the social circumstances that have generated and developed over the racism that has historically been maintained in our communities.
Luis, thank you. That's I mean, everything that you described, right, is incredibly powerful and jarring. And I remember the riots, but I also remember, you know, I'm in South Texas. I'm watching it on TV, and it feels like a world away. It feels like it feels foreign to me. You and you kind of, right, juxtaposing this experience with also your parents' separation. And I don't know about you. I mean, me, I'm watching this on TV, and I turn to my parents and I ask them to explain to me, what is that? What's going on? For you, and you said, right, you didn't have the mind and the awareness that you have now. Who did you turn to? Who explains what's going on to you at that moment?
I mean, the closest folks that I had to talk to about, you know, things that was happening out in the neighborhood were my cousins. They were 4 and 6 years older than me, but you know, and they're both USC graduates, as well as I. Uh, you know, so they were my role models, right? Because as the eldest in a single parent home, right, I had a lot of baggage to process, and they were there. They lived downstairs from the apartment building where we lived, and so they were my go-to all the time. Um, but you know, I didn't have to ask them to understand what was going on, right? Because it was happening all over television,
Mhm.
right? Prior to the days, what was on television was the court trial, the Rodney King trial, right? Where the four white officers were acquitted, right? And for as long as that trial went on, right, we were watching it because there was nothing else to watch on TV. We didn't have cable,
Yeah.
right? It was just all the news channels were focused on the Rodney King trial, and that's where I started processing, right, the racism that was so obvious, right? And to the degree that they beat this man who's no longer with us, right? It's like you didn't have to do all of that for
Yeah.
that long. So we were just processing the trial and talking about, right, the racism that exists in our communities, right? That was one of the worst examples of racism,
Yeah.
right? But we saw it every day when our parents were being harassed by white police officers, pulling them over, right? Profiling them, asking them for license, asking them for insurance. In 1991, 1992, right, there were other propositions going on, right? Governor Pete Wilson uh, was holding his position, right, as governor, but he was just associated with so many propositions that were targeting
Mhm.
Latino families. So, you know, we were kind of like saying, yeah, we know that's happening, but you know, at that point, right, in the Rodney King trial, we were just sort of processing everything as this is stuff that we know is happening in our communities. Um,
Luis, for so many of my guests, they talk about education as an escape. And you sing and right for us, I think for those of us watching on TV, from those of us at a distance, like I said, it's kind of an awakening and just like, I can't believe this is happening. But like you said, you experienced it all the time and you saw it, and your parent, you know, you saw your parents' experiences and family members, I'm sure, and others, those around you. At any point, are you thinking, I need to get out of here? And is education my escape? What were you thinking about? Or do you, you know, do you say, I want to fix this? What, you know, what are you thinking about as you're experiencing this and you're thinking about sort of your prospects for a future and for, you know, your own success and well-being?
mhm. Yeah, at that time, I wasn't thinking about, you know, what I wasn't thinking about improving my community, right? I wasn't, right? At 14, I'm thinking, man, why, like, I don't want to live here. I mean, there were other things that I experienced, right? Aside from law enforcement, right? Just being harassed in the street all the time, right? By anyone, you know, gangs or even just people in general. Um, you know, and those experiences wanted me to get out of it. Like, I would say to myself, I want to get out of here. And I did, right? When I went to college, I used that as an excuse to move out. And I wasn't thinking about my family at that time. As the eldest, right? There was, again, you know, so much pressure in being the eldest. Um, and after I graduated high school, right, I was more like, okay, do I stay and help my family, or do I continue to push and try to go to school and make something of myself? So at 14, I wasn't necessarily thinking, um, I want to improve this, right? I
Mhm.
was more on, I need to get out of here.
You you attended USC for undergrad,
For my master's.
for your master's. All right.
So
You
what I
know,
meant,
go ahead. I'm sorry.
go ahead, no, you go ahead.
Well, I was gonna say, you know, I with a lot of my students, I'll ask. I work with a lot of first year college students, and when they come in, I try to meet with all of them, and I'll often ask them, "Was college always part of your plan?"
Mhm.
And you know, I'm always eager to hear what they have to say. Was it a part of your plan?
No, it wasn't. I didn't start thinking about college until my cousins went to college, right? I saw them graduate, right? We lived upstairs, so whatever the family did downstairs, you know, we were part of it too, right? So I started seeing and understanding the college going culture when we moved, right, to South Central, to that part of South Central. Um, because originally when we lived with my dad lived blocks away from USC. He lived on 24th, 23rd and Hoover. And so when we moved to 45th and Avalon, which was the heart of South Central. Um, and so um, I lost my train of thought.
Well, you said college wasn't always part of the plan,
Yeah,
right? But seeing your
yeah,
cousins
it
do
was.
it,
Right,
yeah.
right. Yeah. And so to me, it was like, okay, right. And so when I did move out, I moved out with my cousins because they lived on their own. They were trying to save money too. They were going to SC. I was going to Santa Monica College. I eventually wanted to transfer to USC. Uh, and I ended up, after 4 years of being at the community college, I was working, um, and, you know, going to school, commuting from, we had moved to Lincoln Heights, right above Lincoln High School. There's a big white house that we had moved into. But yeah, we were just commuting. And so after 4 years, I said, hey, I don't care where I transfer to now, let's just transfer. So I transferred to Cal State LA to major in art, right? And I wasn't thinking at that time, I wasn't thinking of becoming a teacher, but right before I graduated in 2004, I thought, okay, what am I going to do with an art degree? I'm gonna want to start a family. Can I support a family on paintings? Can I buy a car on an artist salary? And so at that time, I was really close. I had a really close relationship, and I still do. I have a close relationship with my former Spanish high school teacher, who are now my compadres, who were both educators, right? And I'm at this dilemma, right? And they were constantly talking to me, aconsejándome, what are you gonna do, right? And they were making me think a little bit more about, if you want to start a family, do you think you're going to be able to do that as an artist? And there were times where I couldn't sleep because I was thinking about that. And eventually they said, why don't you become an art teacher? You'll still be able to do what you love, but you'll be able to teach students, right? Something you're passionate about. And when I inquired about that at Cal State LA, all I had to do was take 2 more classes and then obviously the credential. And so that happened, right? And for whatever reason, right, I'll call it the universe wanted to make this happen. I end up teaching at my former high school. And so 14 years later, right? I'll stop it there because there's plenty to say.
So, you get out, you move out with your cousins, you go to a community college and then transfer, right? And you're an art teacher now and an art educator. Do you have those conversations? Do students ask you, what can I do with an art degree? What am I going to do? And those same conversations that your compadres had with you, do you find yourself having those conversations with your students?
I do. I have those conversations with my students now, right, at the college level. Mm-hmm. Because I do tell them, look, I want you all to think about this, right? Here are your options. You can be an artist. That's fine. You can be an artist and an art teacher during the day. Good job with benefits, weekends, holidays, vacation, and you can continue being an artist, right? And like that's what I share with them that I do, and that's the way that I navigated this whole being an artist and being an educator. But when it came to high school students, they asked, right? And with them, I had to paint symbolically paint the picture for them. And I had to be honest with them about how much money I was making after 14 years. Right? And a lot of them were like, wow, right? Like, do you really make that much money? I'm like, yeah, you do, right? It's just every year that you teach, it counts as 1 year of experience and your salary goes up, right? And all this other stuff, right? And so, talking to students about the possibility of them focusing on something that they're really passionate about, that really kind of turned on the light for them, right? And so, I said, so-and-so, you like history. What specific history do you want to focus on? And they'd be like, I don't know, Greek mythology or Mexican-American history. I'm like, well, if you want to focus on that, you can. Then you can teach history while you do your trips, right? And say that it's for research purposes, and use it as a text writer, right? Because
Yeah.
you're using actual images of historical sites to teach your students, right? And so that's how I would break it down for them, right? In terms of when we would talk about going to college.
What was it like for you to return to your high school?
Every year it's been a learning experience,
Yeah.
but especially the first 5 years, because the first 5 years, here I am, first year teacher,
Mhm.
right? And knowing that I have this privilege of coming back to my high school and doing something that I never imagined doing, right? And one of the things that I constantly thought about was what experiences were most impactful for me as a high school student,
Mhm.
and how can I mirror that through my teaching. That's something that I constantly reflected on my first 5 years, right? And I made the mistakes of thinking that I should teach the way I was taught.
Mm.
Right? And at one point, I had a dilemma about that, because I recalled my own experiences as a high school student. And here in California, unfortunately, there's the A through G requirements, right? It's A through G requirements are courses that students are supposed to meet in order to be college eligible. 4 years of math, 4 years of science, 3 years of science, 4 years of English, 1 year of art, unfortunately,
Mm.
right? And so what I wanted to do, right, with that is push that narrative, right? Push that uh, that opportunity, because I would see so much talent, raw talent in students that were taking me in one class. And unfortunately, I couldn't teach them anymore because we didn't offer other art classes. And the counselor would say, well, this student already took art. They don't need it again. Right. And so slowly but surely, right, I started advocating for diverse art classes, painting, drawing, introduction to art. Over the course of 6 years, I created an AP path. So
Wow.
from introduction to art, painting, drawing, and then the last class as a senior would be AP, right, where they would submit advanced placement portfolios. And that was the first semester. The second semester, we would focus on service learning projects in the community. And so that's sort of what I did my first 6 years as a high school teacher, right? I advocated for an experience that I never really had, for the reason that I was only, as an artist, right, I was only able to take one art class. And I wanted to go to an art school. And the challenging part about that too was that when I did try to apply to an art school, they said, well, do you have a portfolio? Well, how do I build a portfolio? Well, you should have taken art for 4 years. Well, the school that I attended, right, which is a Title I school, it's one of the most marginalized areas of Los Angeles, they don't have that type of program. And so I wanted to change that for students. And so now there's students who have portfolios, who either took my class because they loved my class, or who either took the class because they wanted to become artists. But whether they went on to be social workers or science majors, they had a portfolio by the end of the year.
Wow. You know, a lot of my guests talk about in their own journey, not knowing, right? You know, for you, it was applying to art school and not knowing that you needed a portfolio, but also that, you know, your school didn't give you those opportunities, right? You, like you said, it was a Title I school, you have one art class. And so your opportunities are limited. And so a lot of my guests talk about, in the roles that they have now, creating those opportunities for other people, for the young people that they serve or in the positions that they're in. So congratulations for doing that, right? Because like you said, you struggled those early years to I think a lot of teachers, right, fall into that trap of teaching the same way they were taught, seeing the same things that they see. And that's okay, right? You recognizing that, no, that's not okay. You wanted to create more opportunities you saw, and you thinking of your own experiences and reflecting on that. Luis, you're having this profound effect on your students. You're creating opportunities at your school. At the end of the day, that's powerful work. That's incredibly meaningful work. At what point do you say, I need to get a master's degree?
So, and let me add to that context too, right? One of the reasons why I was at the community college for 4 years was because when I applied to an art school right after high school, they said, well, you need a portfolio. So I went to the community college and tried to build a portfolio by taking art classes for 4 years. And so, again, coming back to your question, sorry, I blanked out again.
No. So, well, it sounds like even there at the community college, taking the classes, trying to build that portfolio, was there nobody there to guide you and to say, Luis, this is how you're going to do it?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So going back to your question, right? At one point I got my master's, so I'm gonna plant that seed and leave it there. But yeah, at the community college level, I built this relationship with the first and only African-American art professor that I've had to this day.
Wow.
I've only had one African-American art, as an African-American art professor. It's the only professor that I've had that's Black and that taught art. His name's Ronald Davis at Santa Monica Community College, who's may he rest in peace. And he passed away last year. But I kept in touch with him after 2002. When I left Santa Monica College, and he was my guide in terms of my decisions. Ultimately, they were my decisions, but I would always ask him, to tell me what he thought, and he was very supportive in every which way. But in 2009, I was doing a couple of things, right? So I had built this AP track, art track. And then I was starting to do community engaged work with students. But I felt that I needed to do more, right? I felt that I wasn't there as a teacher yet. And that there was a lot that I still needed to learn. And not traditionally, right? I didn't want to teach in any of the ways that I was taught, with the exception of my chemistry teacher. My chemistry teacher was very influential. He was also my volleyball coach. And to this day, I just got off the phone with him this weekend, because we talked for Father's Day. And so he's been there for me, despite me being in Northern California. But he's been around, right? The same way that my professor Ron Davis has been around as well. But at that point, right, I started working with the Cesar Chavez Foundation. In 2007, I started working with the Cesar Chavez Foundation. And here's another resource that's helping myself as a teacher of color. How to draw on the philosophy of Cesar Chavez and apply it to, the learning that's happening in marginalized communities. And in a sense, it is a form of activism, right? To draw on the philosophy of Cesar Chavez and apply that to a teaching philosophy. So in 2007, 2008, I'm starting to work with the Chavez Foundation. And this is when the Cesar Chavez Foundation has the yearly Cesar Chavez Walk in downtown LA. And so their program invited both educators and my students, and they would engage us in this programming every year to where we were working together to think about the issues that are affecting our communities and how would we be able to address them collectively, right? And so this was something that was drawing on critical pedagogy before I kind of, really dove into critical pedagogy, right? It was talking about dialogue, right? Dialogue that exists between students, teachers, and the community. It was talking about co-teaching and co-learning, right? Yes, I was teaching my students about art, right? But what were they learning? What was I learning from them?
Mhm.
I was learning about their communities, their homes. What issues in their communities were affecting them at school and at home? And what was I doing as an educator to improve any of that, right? Was my responsibility just focused in the classroom? Or is my responsibility focused on creating a overall well-being in the classroom by addressing the issues that were happening in the community? So, around 2007, 2008, like I said, I was already working with the Cesar Chavez Foundation. And in 2009, I'm like kind of getting anxiety. I don't know if you want to call it teaching anxiety, but I would say I'm not doing enough, right? And so I started thinking, okay, is it time for me to get an MFA? Is it time for me to think about a master's in education? And I said, I don't need a master's in education. I'm already an artist, like I'm already a teacher. What I was thinking about is my future, right? I eventually want to teach at the college level. And so that's when I applied to USC, right? I applied to their MFA program. But they told me, you know what, our MFA program is very competitive. Would you consider applying for the Master in Public Art Studies? We see that you have experience in public art. We think you're a good fit for this program as well. And I said, okay, fine, right? I applied to both in hopes that I would get into both. And no, I didn't. I only got into the Master of Public Art Studies program. And so there, in a nutshell, my thesis focused on using public art, public education, and critical pedagogy in South Central Los Angeles. Because we very well known, I mean, those from Southern California and those that know USC, very well known that there's this private institution anchored in the middle of the hood that's not advocating for students in the hood.
Yeah.
It's catering to students from upper middle class families, and it's not advocating for that community. It's not creating sustainable bridges that are giving local residents opportunity to come to USC and to go back to their communities and improve them. So there was a little tension, right, with my advisors and my faculty when I came up with this idea, because they wanted me to focus my dissertation on controversial art that was happening in the East Coast. And I'm like, and we're in the middle of South Central in the
Yeah.
West Coast, right? And I'm over here saying public art, public education, and critical pedagogy in South Central Los Angeles. What does that do to improve communities?
Yeah.
Right? And why is it, it's a public art program. This is how this is my contribution to public art.
Yeah.
From the perspective of someone that's coming from it, that developed from it, not
Yeah.
by some white person that's talking about the hood.
Yeah. If anyone were to, if there was anybody, if anybody should speak on it, it should be somebody like you, right? Somebody who grew up there, who understands the tensions, understands, right? It's everything that you grew up with, everything that you saw. And to see that tension existing, right? This institution, this very wealthy institution, catering to a specific population that looks nothing, right, like the students and the young people that surround that institution. If anybody should be speaking to that, it should be you. So congratulations. I'm glad you were able to do that. And, I am, I'm reminded, well, one thing, you said there was some tension with your advisors. Was there anybody among the faculty that stood up for you and said, he needs to do this, he needs to do this work? Who advocated for you, please?
Well, there was there were a couple of people in my committee. One of them being Judy Baca.
Wow.
And Judy Baca was one of she wasn't my chair, right? One of the professors there was my chair, but Judy Baca was part of my committee, and my work just was drawing on public art, right? And aside from have done my internship with her that same year, I was using so much out of the Social and Public Art Resource Center, right? That she founded in terms of how to connect with marginalized youth. That's the foundation of her work, of using art, right? Public art with marginalized youth, right? For marginalized communities. So she was just fully, like, I have your back, Luis, right? But because her association was not with USC, she was looked at more out of as an outsider, right? Powerful outsider, I'll add. But the one Professor Christina Oki was the one that had advocated for me, and so I'm not exactly sure where she is now. Like, I've looked for her. I know she was originally from Germany, but what caught me by surprise is that she actually started researching critical pedagogy. Because what I did, right, is I drew on all the theories that were covered in my program, but what I added was Paulo Freire's perspective of critical pedagogy, critical education, and none of them knew who that was. Right. And that's what they were pushing back against. Right. This seems like radical theory, right? And like, it is. Right. And so Christina, right, started researching what critical pedagogy was. Right. And she was the one that took it upon herself to learn about what I was talking about and how it fit into public art. So she was the one that initially was like, hey, we need to respect, right, what he wants to do. And we need to do our homework. Right.
Luis, let me ask you, because, graduate school can be, college can be an intimidating space, right? And especially for students of color, students of marginalized backgrounds, finding one's voice isn't always the easiest thing. What advice would you give a young person, a student, maybe you give to your own students, who are struggling to advocate for themselves, are struggling to find their voice and to lean into that voice and to trust that voice?
I don't know how to put this in a nutshell, but the one thing I would say is that one of the things that I was taught early on by my professor, Ron Davis, right? When I was first in his class, I was trying to do all this mainstream art that was trending, right? And first thing he asked me is like, "Hey man, where are you from?" And I kind of looked at him, because those words to me, right, where I'm coming from, where I'm growing up, those means, what hood are you from, right? And I'm like, I'm not in a gang. And he's like, no, you're not, but you know what I'm talking about. Where are you from? And I told him South Central. I'm like, and then he pointed at the work that I was working on, right? And he's like, is this the shit you see in your hood? And I said, no. And he's like, well, why don't you keep it real and draw from what you've seen in your own neighborhood and complete this assignment that I'm asking you to do by keeping it real, and tell me who you are based on what you've seen in your neighborhood. And that was the first time I learned I'm gonna draw on the knowledges that I generated at home in my neighborhood. I'm gonna draw from the experiences that I generated in my home and in my neighborhood, and I'm gonna use this to navigate academia. So I was taught that at the community college. And ever since then, right, I've constantly shown my students, you're going to learn about the elements of art and principles of design, because those are all components that you need to create art. But the art that you create is going to be based on your experiences at home and your experiences in this neighborhood and the experiences of your ethnic background and your culture. Right. And so that's when I started diving into the funds of knowledge, right? Once I in grad school and getting my PhD, because I was just fully drawing from critical pedagogy at one point, that when I got to my doctorate program, I started discovering other similar theories that I use now. But what I always tell students is, look, whatever spaces you're navigating, whether it's work, whether it's school, whether it's whatever it is, keep it real and talk from the language that you speak, talk from the experiences that you've had, walk through the paths, right, that you've walked, and use that perspective. Because I can guarantee students that the unfortunate part about education at the K through college level is that many educators do not value the knowledge that we bring from home and our neighborhoods. And we need to teach them, right, to acknowledge these resources of knowledge as academic resources in their classroom. So that's what I say to someone that's, questioning their identity as a scholar, as an artist, as a teacher, as a sociologist. Keep it real.
I love that. I love that. You mentioned being exposed, learning about critical pedagogies, and then going to and getting a PhD. You community college, transfer, university, go to USC for your master's. And what led you to the PhD? Because at that point, right, you've got the master's, you can go and work at a university, right? You can lecture, right? It opens doors for you, but you wanted to continue pursuing your education and learning. Why?
So the unfortunate part about a Master of Public Art master's, right, was that it's not an MFA. And for that reason, I couldn't get a job as a drawing or painting instructor or as an art instructor at the community college, which was ultimately what I wanted.
Yeah.
So I received my master's in 2009, and I do want to share this too, because I think it's important, right? I didn't learn about Paulo Freire and Pedagogy of the Oppressed through school. It was a book that a friend recommended to me. And he said, you know what? Your work reminds me of Freire. And I'm like, what do you mean? He's like, yeah, you don't know who Freire is? And I'm like, nope. And he's like, dude, right? So he tells me, buy this book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And I bought it the same year, right? That my last year when I was doing my dissertation. And so and then I recall the name coming up too when I was doing the Cesar Chavez training with my students, right? They talk about Freire, and they talk about concientización, right? Critical consciousness. So then I'm like, I finally made the connections, and I'm like, this is it, right? So again, because I couldn't get my MFA, the title that I really wanted to teach at the college level, I'm thinking that I just wasted all this money at USC. And to some degree, I still do. But it's sort of an expensive stepping stone, right? That led me to where I am now.
Yeah.
But the reason why, right, I wanted to continue is that I also thought to myself, you know what? I'm starting to do this sort of art and activism in art education. And I honestly think this is unique, right? It's unique. It's a unique approach to art education. And at the beginning of the year in 2012, I was invited to publish with two professors from Cal State Fullerton. And that was my affirmation of, hey man, this is great work.
Yeah.
And that same year later on, I said, okay, I think I'm gonna dive into a PhD program, because at the same time, between 2009 and 2012, I started getting involved with critical education teacher groups around Los Angeles. And there were graduate students that were part of those groups. There were activists that were part of those groups, all in the same groups, right? And so I'm getting the activism component, right, of the neighborhoods, and I'm also getting the academic component of activism. And I'm starting to think in just other levels, right? Because one thing to think about too is that you're not going to get this type of critical professional development at your school site.
Yeah.
You know, and if you ask any teacher that's attended professional development, it's a joke sometimes. And so I found other educators from other subjects that were thinking in a critical way, right? And they were pushing the normalized education, right? Eurocentric education, they were pushing against it. And I felt like, wow, like there's other teachers that think like me in terms of education. So a lot was happening in 2012, right? I was asked to publish with two professors. I'm part of these teacher organizations. And let me add one more thing. I was arrested in front of the high school that I was teaching in 2012. There was a police officer that was issuing citations to parents that were dropping off their students, their kids. But the officer was being discreet, right? He wasn't letting parents know, hey, I'm giving you a ticket. He was just writing down license plate after license plate after license plate. And all he was doing was sitting on his bike, just writing the license plates down. And he had done it the day before, and I didn't say anything because I approached my principal and I said, hey, so-and-so, that officer is issuing tickets without telling parents. And the principal was like, hey, it's not my problem. Right. And
Wow.
so that night, I'm not lying, man, that night I couldn't sleep over that, about how pissed off I was. And again, like I mentioned it before, I grew up, right, getting harassed by the police in many ways, including being racially profiled, right? My parents being racially profiled. I knew parents whose cars were taken away because, unfortunately, undocumented parents didn't have licenses. So the next day, right, I saw him again, the officer, and I went up to my principal again and I said, hey, are you going to do something about this, or am I? And he's like, oh, no, don't do anything. Don't do anything, right? And then the officer, and I said, excuse me, sir, I wanted to ask if you can let me know what you're doing, right? You're in front of the school, and it looks like to me you're writing down license plates of cars who you're going to issue a ticket later. And he ignored me. And then I said, okay, if you want to ignore me, that's fine, but I'm going to take your badge number and I'm going to call the police department and let them know what you're doing. And he seemed to get frustrated when I said that, right? Because at that point he slammed closed his little booklet and he said, come here, let me talk to you. And, I kind of kept walking and ignoring him the same way he did. But at that point, I started telling parents, ¿sabe qué, señora? El señor no pare porque el policía le está grabando su licencia y le va a dar la multa después. And I started going car by car by car by car, and that obviously upset him. And so he went up to my face and he yelled at me, right? And he said, let me see your ID. And I said, I'm not going to show you my ID because I have no reason to. Long story short, right? Think of a fight in high school, right? When two people are about to fight, se hace la bolita, right? Like students and parents started gathering, cell phones are out. And the officer said, if you don't show me your ID, I'm going to arrest you. And I gave my backpack and my stuff to a student, and they put handcuffs on me, they put me in the car, and they took me to the station. But by that time, social media was a lifesaver, because this other activist teacher, right, who was part of the group of teachers that I was that I would meet with every month. The activist network just kind of flipped all switches, and it sort of went viral. And then at the station, everyone was like, why didn't you tell us you were a teacher? And I'm like, it doesn't matter. Like you were violating your responsibility as an officer, right? And so, so all of that was happening in 2012. Again, reminding you, right? And so at that point, I'm like, I'm doing this PhD thing because my voice is needed. The work of what better language than the one of someone that's grown up in that community, someone that's taught in that community, someone that can really talk to the experiences of folks in that community, of marginalized folks in that community. And I said, I have to do this, right?
Yeah.
And I'm gonna do this to show that there's a different way of approaching education. Even if there's an underfunded art program, if you teach art education or education in critical, transformative ways, even though that you have a low budget or you're in a marginalized school, that's going to be far more for students and the community than traditional education?
You know, it's funny, the experiences, right? Our life experiences and where they lead us and how they inform, right? Where we see ourselves and the work that we need to be doing. You go on and you get a PhD. You are currently a faculty member, right? Sacramento State.
Mm-hmm.
The work that you're doing now, because I feel like for you, it's your life experiences have constantly informed the work that you do, the teaching that you're doing, your relationships to the community. Tell me about the work that you're doing now, Luis, whether it's with your students or in the community that you're in now, your new community. Tell me about the work that you're doing now.
Yeah, so I think I need to speak in two directions, if you want to call them that. But where has the direction of my artistic career, where is it, right? Because we keep hearing about my degrees, right? Not necessarily my work. And so, yeah, I think to some degree, I've taken a hit on my work as an artist because I want to focus on improving the pedagogical approaches within art education for marginalized communities. And so do I focus on my work? And now that I have a family, should I focus on the career or the profession that's giving me benefits, that's giving me the availability to spend time with my son in the evening or even on weekends? So the work that I do now, I continue to work with high schools. I continue to work with teacher education programs because my goal is always to improve the way teachers approach their education. And I want their teaching to be transformative, right? And so that's sort of where I'm focusing my work on now. At the college level, I specifically focus in art education. And so while traditionally art education looks at art theory, I'm bringing in non-traditional education theory to art education, like critical pedagogy, like critical race theory, like the funds of knowledge. And after 14 years of teaching at the high school level, yeah, I could have continued to teach at the high school level because at year 15, year 16, I'm at the top of the salary scale. And as a matter of fact, I'm making more. I would have been making more now as a teacher, high school teacher, than what I'm doing now. I took a mean old pay cut. But I have the luxury of both my wife and I, working together. But what I focus on now is really preparing the next generation of educators to teach in critical ways, to teach in ways where they're going to recognize the assets and the knowledge that students bring from home and really use it to help students think critically about their communities. What I was doing as a high school teacher is I was teaching students to think critically about the way they engage in their communities through art. I wasn't preparing artists. To some degree I did, but my focus was for students to think critically about the communities they live in, think critically about how to change them, and think critically about how they themselves can become a better version of themselves. But at the college level, I'm also trying to do that. But again, I feel that we could do the same work for the rest of our lives. But I guess with me, there's been transitions. And so, for example, my master's degree was a transition for me. 2012 was a transition for me.
Mhm.
And now 2019 was a transition for me, right? 2019 was the day the year that I transferred to Sacramento, that I moved to Sacramento to start this position in art education. And at the same time, right, it was the year that my son was born, which he was the reason why one of the reasons why I moved to Sacramento. You know, so there's always a transition every other year. And so who knows what the next transition is going to be. But my work is still the same, just at a different level.
Yeah. You talked about your own art and taking a hit. What tell me about that artwork. Tell me about the art that you would like to be creating.
I mean, I always seem to find the time, right? When,
Yeah.
like, the last body of work that I created was right before I moved to Sacramento. In 2018, I created a body of work called Cruising LA's Political Landscape. And the artwork was, I used newspapers from the Los Angeles Times,
Mhm.
where I cut different headlines, and I pretty much created my own headlines. But the idea of cruising LA's political landscape was to use cruising to think critically about our history, right? And so I kind of introduced this term called critical car culture narrative, right?
Mm.
And so I draw on car culture to critique our historical narratives. And I'll give you one example. I created a newspaper, LA Times front page with images from 1959, from when the city of Los Angeles and the LAPD, and the LA sheriffs, went into the homes of Mexican families in Chavez Ravine and forcefully removed them from their homes because the city had taken their homes through eminent domain to build Dodger Stadium. And so it's 1959. So what you see in the front is a 1959 Cadillac Eldorado cruising in front of the house where the sheriffs and LAPD are pulling the families from their homes. So that's the idea of cruising LA's political landscape. And the political landscape in 1959 was the families being pulled from their homes from Chavez Ravine.
Wow. And that's powerful. Wow. Is there do you have like a website or something where I can see this? Because I'd love to see this.
I'll share, because the LA Times published it. It was published, and the funny thing is that the LA Times published it the same day that my son was born.
Wow.
And I kept the newspaper, right? Obviously, but when my son gets older, I want to tell him this is what was happening the day you were born. And he's going to see my artwork in there.
Well, as important as the work that you're doing is, because it's incredibly important, right? You know, educating future teachers, right? Absolutely incredibly important. You know, I find myself doing similar work. I hope you're able to continue your own art. I hope you're able to continue to do the work that inspires you, and to take a critical lens to your own, right, the work that you want to be doing, your own artwork. Thanks for sharing the link. You know, when I post the podcast, I'll make sure to may I share the link when I upload the podcast?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah, man, wow.
Yeah, and obviously I have one from 1992.
Wow.
But yeah, I mean, at the same time, right, you know, I think about this, right? The privilege that I have. I'm a professor of color teaching educators how to think in a revolutionary way, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, there's my work as an artist, right? And really what I try to do as an artist is spotlight the socioeconomic circumstances that we live in, right? And because I'm keeping it real, like my prophet taught me, right?
Yeah.
And growing up in LA, right? Cars were a big part of LA culture.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm bringing that in as well. But, you know, one of the things that I continue to love, man, and I miss is working with students. And so since coming to Sac State, one of the reasons why I came to Sac State is when I was researching my position, I stumbled upon a syllabus that was called Art 148, Barrio Art for ethnic groups. And I looked at it and I'm like, dude, like this is the stuff that I'm doing here in LA.
Yeah.
Right. It engages students in the community to gain teaching experience through the art making process. So it's pretty much students going into an elementary to tutor, to teach them art. But it hasn't been taught since 2009. And so I apply to a grant at the university to bring this class back, and I get the grant. I get the maximum amount. And this past semester was the first spring that I brought that class back up. Yeah, because it hadn't been taught since 2009. And I brought artists from the community that I thought were also doing teaching in revolutionary ways. And, you know, it was just a different experience for students from many other subjects, not just art, right? On how they could potentially use art in an interdisciplinary way through their whatever focus they want. But they worked in the community with students and they gained teaching experience. And some of them questioned, I don't think I really want to teach after this, right? After engaging with students, I'm not sure if teaching is for me. But then other students said, yeah, I know this is for me, right? And so I do see my work as in two separate ways, as an artist and as a pedagogue and as an educator. They're as equally valuable. I think I'm in balance right now in terms of how I'm managing both, right? But I do feel that one is much more important than the other, right? I would get more satisfaction out of knowing that I taught a group of teachers how to really connect with their students. And on the other hand, the art making process for me, it's more selfish.
Luis, thank you. I want to be mindful of your time because I know we're organizing, setting this up, right? You know, your schedule, right? I want to make sure that we keep to that schedule. So before we go, one, I wish you well. I know you're going to continue to do amazing work with the teachers, and I hope, I do hope you get to be a little selfish, because I think I think anytime we create something, right, there's a bit of selfishness to it. I think it sounds like a lot of the work, the art that you were creating, was still very important, right? To be able to turn a critical lens and on particularly, right, the historical period in LA. I think that's important work, right? It's you become not only a storyteller, but a historian, and there's so many roles that you play in that. And so I hope you are a little selfish and you are able to do some of that work for yourself and for the community around you. But before we go, any last piece of advice for our listeners?
Do what you love. Do what you love, and if you're able to, do what you love while you improve the lives of others. But learn from them first. Learn from the communities that you're working with and collaborate with them. Learn from them and teach them at the same time. And teach them to think critically about themselves, about their communities, about the spaces that they're in. And like my teacher, Ron Davis, told me, keep it real.
Well said. Well said. Thank you. Thank you, Luis. Thank you for your time. And thank you for your story. Thank you for your story, man. That was great.
And thank you for considering me. And I don't mind if you feel that we didn't cover something, and you want to say, hey, Luis, you think you have some time to talk about this part. I feel we didn't cover it enough. Let me know.
Absolutely. That's one of the challenges of the podcast is, there's always so much more to cover, but I always also want to be respectful of my guest time. So, but we will definitely reconnect. We will definitely reconnect, and I'd love to come back and we can talk some more about some of the other aspects, right?
Yeah.
But for now, Luis, thank you for your time. Thank you to our listeners out there. This concludes another episode of the Way to College podcast. Please make sure you subscribe, follow, rate, all of that good stuff. And please share the podcast with your own networks. And we'll see you soon. Thank you, and bye-bye.
All right. Take care.